So this month's question is about the nature of love. What is the nature of love? So I think the question of what love is quite often misunderstood. And the way I think about this question has very much to do with looking at the meaning and nature and significance of love in a spiritual context, in a context of spiritual enlightenment. So the context of spiritual enlightenment really is one in which we look at life and every experience of life through a very different lens, through a very different perspective. And we try to lift the veil of the relative and the personal dimensions of life and try to see life and the human experience from a perspective that's not so personal, it's not so small, from one that we could even dare to call absolute or dimension of seeing things in a perspective that isn't relative, one that's absolute. So from a relative or non-absolute perspective, there's all kinds of experiences of love, which is a felt sense of connection and intimacy and sympathy, affection. For example, my little dog. I love him to death. But that love is very personal. Then there's romantic love, which is romantic and sexual love, which is an emotional experience, and it's also felt a biologically programmed sensory experience. After one has lived for a few years and has fallen in and out of love a few times, one begins to understand that the experience of romantic and sexual love is an intoxicating illusion, and it's one that's impermanent because it doesn't last. Of course, when one is having the experience, it often seems that it's the most powerful and earth-shaking and real experience one has ever had. But because one falls out of love as easily as one falls in love, especially if one has this experience many times, one begins to realize, the experience of falling in love, of seeing the other as being perfect, was part of a very sophisticated illusion, intoxicating illusion, ecstatically experienced illusion. But an illusion nonetheless, something that wasn't ultimately real. There is the love that one feels for one's family, one's kin, one's mother, one's father, one's sister and brother. That kind of love has very much to do with our biology being connected to others through blood. It's an experience of an intimate connection that's related to being part of a tribe, part of a biologically knitted group of individuals who see themselves as a unit, separate and apart from the other units, and separate and apart from nature, and separate and apart from the world. So the sense of love and affection and intimacy and communion that one can experience with one's relatives, one's loved ones, can be very powerful also, and is. But all these more personal, relative experiences of love that I've been speaking about, from romantic love to the love of one's animals to the love of one's family and parents, when seen in the light of the experience of a kind of love that isn't relative, a kind of love that's absolute, spiritual love, all these lesser, more relative, more personal experiences of love begin to pale in comparison. It doesn't mean they're completely insignificant, but it means we begin to see them as being aspects or dimensions of the human experience that are important, but are not as important and not as absolutely real as the kind of love we discover when we experience a non-relative or absolute dimension of our own self, the level of consciousness. The nature of the deepest part of our own self, your own self and my own self, is consciousness. And something very interesting begins to happen when you begin to focus your attention on the deepest part of yourself and the deepest part of who you are. And the way that's done is simply by beginning to remove your attention from the objects that arise in awareness, the thoughts that arrive in awareness, and the emotions that are associated with them. When you begin to focus your attention on that infinite, open, empty space or ground in which objects arise, and not on the objects themselves, you'll find that what you're beginning to focus upon is something that's not an object. It's no thing or nothingness or emptiness. So when you begin to focus your attention on emptiness or nothingness, especially for significant periods of time, you'll find that there's a certain sense, ability, a sense of feeling, a certain spiritual feeling quality, a sense of joy, to be causeless joy, because it doesn't come from any particular desire being fulfilled. It comes when you begin to focus your attention on nothing at all, a causeless sense of joy begins to arise from the deepest part of your own self, the deepest part of your own being. And when this causeless joy is experienced in a very profound and very powerful way, one recognizes that one is experiencing a kind of impersonal, absolute love that is more intoxicating, more fulfilling, more gratifying, and more liberating than any other kind of love you could possibly experience. And the reason for that is this kind of love, this impersonal, absolute, non-relative love, is infinite. It has no beginning and no end. It is the very nature of the ground of your own being and my own being. Love is the very nature of consciousness itself. And finally, there's a very big way to look at the meaning and significance of love as it relates to the experience of existence itself. And in order to go into this question, we have to get a little bit philosophical. And the way that we do this is we ask, the $64,000 question, the most important question that there is, I think, for philosophically, spiritually, serious-minded individuals. We want to ask the question, when God created the universe, or when something came from nothing 14 billion years ago, when the Big Bang occurred, was that event a big yes, a big no, or a big neutral? I've come to the conclusion that that event, when something came from nothing, was a big yes. To put it in theological terms, when that event happened, when the Big Bang occurred, the unmanifest or uncreated God made a decision at some point to create a material universe in his or her form. Of course, the form of God, and one realizes when one begins to have spiritual experiences, is consciousness itself. So he or she or it made a decision to create the world of time and space, to initiate this entire creative process. When you or I begin to focus upon the desire to exist, the creative impulse itself, when you or I experience the urge to create, when we experience the sexual impulse, which is an evolutionary impulse, when you or I experience the urge to innovate, to create new things, great innovators, great geniuses in all fields of life, when they're inspired by the creative impulse, they're being driven by that same initial spark, that same energy and intelligence that initiated the entire creative process. And when you or I experience the spiritual impulse, which is the urge to become more conscious, the felt desire to become more conscious, more awake, more connected with yourself and with life itself, that's also the evolutionary impulse. And the nature of that impulse, the nature of the drive to become, the will to exist, is the nature of love itself. It is experienced as an ecstatic longing, an ecstatic compulsion. It's the will towards life. It's the will to exist. And that will, the desire to become, the will to live, the desire to exist, the creative impulse and the creative instinct is the manifest expression of love. And I wish I had more time to share all these things with you because we really just scratched the surface. But I hope this will stimulate some very interesting dialogue and discussion. Thank you very much.